at 1400 hours. The Eisenhower Executive Conference Room felt heavy with polished oak, brass nameplates, and the low hum of the HVAC system. Around the table, senior Pentagon officials and a Gulf State Defense delegation leaned over binders thick with procurement contracts. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The official interpreter, seated just behind the U.S. lead negotiator, kept his eyes on the minister as he relayed a key clause about depot-level maintenance support. Somewhere in his delivery, the meaning shifted. What was meant as a cooperative maintenance agreement came out as an immediate demand for full payment in advance. The minister's jaw tightened. His aide scribbled something in Arabic. The scrape of his chair against the floor was louder than it should have been. Emily Torres was in the far corner, her navy blue contractor polo tucked into khaki pants, a rolling mop bucket at her side. At 29, she had learned the art of moving unseen, her steps quiet on the carpet. She was wiping down the far wall's baseboards. Eyes down, but ears tuned, like they had been back in her days as an Air Force linguist. The faint Gulf Arabic lilt cut through the room, sharp with offense. She saw the minister push his binder away and stand, the gold embroidery on his bisht catching the recessed lights. His bodyguard shifted, ready to follow. The U.S. lead tried to interject, but the damage was already settling in. Emily's left hand stilled on the rag. Her right adjusted the mop handle so it wouldn't tip over. The conference table blocked most views of her, but she could see the minister's stride angle toward the exit. She took one step forward, her voice even, but carrying, in flawless Gulf Arabic. She asked the minister to forgive the misunderstanding and explained that the agreement was intended as a fair partnership, not an insult. Heads turned, chairs stopped creaking. Even the bodyguard paused mid-step. The minister's shoes stopped short of the door. Slowly, he turned, studying her as though measuring something unseen. The room's ranking colonel leaned back slightly, his hand brushing the folder in front of him, eyes narrowing in silent calculation. Emily didn't drop her gaze. Her stance was easy, weight balanced, just like she had learned standing in briefing rooms overseas. There was no sign of rank on her clothes now, no patch or insignia, just the posture of someone who understood both languages in play. She let the silence stretch, a skill she'd learned intercepting live comms where the next word mattered more than the last. The minister's brow eased a fraction. He asked if she had lived in the region. Emily nodded once and said she had spent years stationed in Oman. No elaboration, no mention of sorties or classified rooms. Just the truth in the simplest form. The interpreter adjusted his tie, looking at the floor. The U.S. lead sat back, relief flickering for a moment before the poker face returned. Across the table, a defense attaché scribbled in the margin of his notepad. Emily stepped back toward her mop, letting the gravity of the moment settle where it needed to. The minister gave the smallest nod before returning to his seat, the gold trim of his sleeve brushing the table's edge. The meeting resumed, but the undercurrent had changed. Emily went back to her work, her reflection faint in the polished wood, unseen but impossible to ignore now. In the careful way she placed the mop back into the bucket, in the unhurried turn toward the service door, her past and present sat side by side. She didn't need to announce what she had done. The quiet correction had already spoken louder than the mistranslation ever could. The undersecretary's pen froze halfway across the page. He looked from Emily to the interpreter, his brow tightening in disbelief. The interpreter shifted in his chair, his face pale, eyes darting toward the minister and then back to Emily as if trying to calculate how much ground he had just lost. A few seats down, the senior Department of Defense protocol officer leaned forward, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "This is a classified level discussion. You do not speak unless authorized." The words landed like a formal reprimand, every syllable wrapped in authority. Emily stood with her hands loosely at her sides, her posture still balanced. She gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the words without accepting the weight behind them. Her face remained steady, her eyes calm. Years of uniform inspections and debriefs had trained her for moments like this, when silence could hold more than an argument. Across the table, the minister's gaze never left her. He spoke again in Arabic, his tone less sharp but probing, as though checking whether the first exchange had been a coincidence. His question carried a subtle challenge, referencing a local expression about trust in agreements. Without missing a beat, Emily answered in the same dialect, weaving in a proverb that matched the cultural nuance exactly. A faint ripple moved through the Gulf delegation, a few of them leaning back in their chairs, reassessing. The undersecretary glanced at the protocol officer, but no one interrupted. The minister's mouth twitched at the edge. Not quite a smile, but no longer closed off. A civilian staffer at the far end, a man in a pressed suit who had been leaning back in smug disinterest, murmured under his breath to the person beside him, "Guess the cleaning crew wants to join the meeting." The smirk was audible in his tone. Emily turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. The movement controlled. In Arabic, she spoke softly but with precision. Intent matters. The phrase hung in the air longer than expected. Even those who did not understand the language felt the shift in the room. The interpreter adjusted his tie, his hands suddenly restless over the papers in front of him. One of the Gulf aides jotted something down, his pen slow and deliberate. The undersecretary exhaled through his nose, not quite approval, but not dismissal either. Emily stepped back toward the wall, her presence still anchored to the center of the room despite the physical distance. The conference picked up again, but the energy had changed. Now, when she moved, eyes tracked her without the obvious motion of turning heads. She had entered as a shadow in the room's corner. Now she was part of its gravity. Emily stepped through the heavy door into the Pentagon's E-ring corridor, the air cooler and quieter than the conference room, but no less controlled. A Marine security guard at the post glanced at her badge before the scanner beeped and the lock released. The faint echo of boots on polished tile carried down the hall, mixed with the low hum of conversation from personnel moving between offices. Halfway to the next checkpoint, a small group stood clustered near a wall-mounted operations map. Two wore Navy service khakis, another in Air Force blues, and a pair of civilians with visitor badges clipped to their lapels. One of the Navy officers, a lieutenant junior, grade, with a sharp jawline, and the easy arrogance of someone who knew the weight of his rank, stepped slightly into her path. "So, I guess you're the general now." His tone carried just enough volume to draw glances from the others. Emily did not break stride. Her gaze stayed forward, her posture measured, shoulders set in a way that came from years of wearing an Air Force uniform. Without looking at him, she replied in flawless Gulf Arabic, her voice calm and even. Rank is earned in more than one way. The words were delivered as if they were part of a casual observation, not a challenge. The lieutenant's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he stepped back. The civilians exchanged a glance, one raising an eyebrow as if realizing they had underestimated her. Emily passed the group without quickening her pace, her badge lanyard swinging slightly with each step. At the next security station, a civilian guard in a black polo scanned her ID again. Beyond him, a line of uniformed personnel moved in precise rhythm, their steps timed as if the building itself set the pace. She merged into the flow, unhurried but steady, her boots making the same quiet cadence as theirs. Her mind did not linger on the comment. Years in the Air Force had taught her that rank could be used as a shield or a weapon, and the best defense was to move with enough control that neither struck home. She had not outranked anyone in that hallway, but she had not been outranked in presence. By the time she reached the elevator lobby, the echo of the group's laughter had faded, replaced by the steady hum of Pentagon machinery and the muted voices of mission briefings in rooms she would never enter. The meeting had resumed for less than 5 minutes when the Gulf State Minister raised a hand, halting the discussion mid-sentence. His gaze moved past the official interpreter to the Pentagon protocol officer. In measured English, he requested that the woman from earlier return as his translator. The interpreter stiffened, fingers tightening around his pen. The protocol officer leaned forward, his tone clipped as he reminded the minister that all translation for this level of discussion required a cleared, designated interpreter. The minister did not raise his voice, but his next words carried weight. Then we wait until she returns. The air in the Eisenhower Executive Conference Room shifted. DoD officials exchanged looks, a silent exchange of risk assessments moving around the table. Clearance protocols mattered, but so did the optics of refusing a visiting defense minister's direct request. The undersecretary's jaw tightened as he considered the balance. A senior Air Force general tapped a finger lightly against his folder, the sound deliberate. It was the kind of moment where hierarchy bent under the pressure of diplomacy. 2 minutes later, a uniformed security aide stepped into the corridor to find her. Emily was halfway to the service elevator, pushing her cleaning cart at a steady pace. She listened without reaction, then turned the cart smoothly back toward the conference wing. At the door, she parked it against the wall with precise alignment, as if the placement mattered. She straightened her contractor polo and adjusted the lanyard of her badge before stepping inside. The room fell quiet at her entrance. Emily walked to the translation station, a simple table with a microphone and headset positioned behind the U.S. delegation. She moved with the same economy of motion she had used in uniform, each step measured, each adjustment purposeful. She placed the headset on, tested the mic with a single word, and waited for the minister to speak. His opening remarks were layered with idioms that would trip a less experienced translator. Emily rendered them in English without hesitation, adjusting the phrasing to preserve the cultural nuance. When the U.S. delegation responded, she caught a subtle shift in tone that could have been interpreted as dismissive. She softened it in Arabic, matching the minister's earlier register. It was seamless enough that no one paused to question it. Over the next 20 minutes, the rhythm of the meeting changed. Chairs that had been angled away from her earlier now turned slightly in her direction. The undersecretary's pen began moving again, this time with quick notes. The Air Force general leaned back, studying her over steepled fingers, his expression shifting from neutral to analytical. Even the interpreter, now sitting off to the side, watched with the resigned focus of someone recognizing skill that could not be faked. Emily did not let her posture change under the attention. Her focus stayed on the language, her delivery unhurried and precise. She understood that every syllable she spoke now was being measured, weighed against the chain of events that had brought her back into the room. By the time the minister outlined his final points, there was no mistaking that the dismissal from earlier had evaporated. The room that had once overlooked her now listened when she spoke. The conference room had emptied into the hallway's controlled flow of uniforms and suits when a uniformed Army staff sergeant stopped Emily by the service cart. His tone was polite, but formal. "Ma'am, the minister requests your presence in a secure office." She followed him past 2 security checkpoints, scanning her badge each time, the muted beep echoing in the quiet corridors. The office was smaller than she expected, wood-paneled with a single framed map of the Gulf region on the wall. A row of challenge coins lined the edge of a credenza, their emblems catching the overhead light. On the desk sat 2 locked document pouches and a secure phone with a muted red indicator. The Gulf State Minister stood as she entered, his aide closing the door behind her. He thanked her in Arabic first, then in English, for preventing what he called a needless fracture in understanding. Emily listened without shifting her stance, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. When he extended an invitation to join the upcoming multinational defense summit as a language advisor, there was a brief stillness in the room. At the far side, a civilian DoD policy advisor adjusted his glasses, his expression a mix of doubt and calculation. The protocol officer from earlier crossed his arms, leaning back as if to signal he had reservations. A senior Air Force colonel, silver eagles catching the light on his uniform, stood near the corner. He did not interrupt, but his eyes found hers. It was the kind of look exchanged between people who had both worn the same service patch. His presence was steady, almost protective, though he said nothing until the minister's aide stepped out with the paperwork. Then, in a tone low enough for her alone, he said it was good to see an old skill set put to use. Emily felt the weight of the moment, but not the rush. She had sat in rooms like this before, though not in years, and she knew that too much reaction could tilt the balance. She thanked the minister in his own dialect, her delivery warm but measured, and accepted the invitation without a pause. She did not speak of her background or the years since she left the Air Force. The colonel gave a single nod, one professional to another. The minister smiled faintly, as if satisfied he had chosen well. Outside, the sound of footsteps in the hallway carried through the door, the tempo of the Pentagon's unbroken rhythm. Inside, Emily signed the necessary forms, her pen steady. She knew this was a shift in her path, but she wore it with the same quiet composure she had held since the first moment in the conference room. When she left, the staff sergeant returned her ID, and she clipped it back to her lanyard with practiced motion. The corridor felt the same as before, cool and precise, but the eyes that followed her now were different. She did not look back. By the next morning, her name had already made its way into break-room conversations. In the corner by the vending machine, two civilian custodial staff kept their voices low, but their eyes followed her as she passed. One of them leaned closer to the other, the tone sharp with disbelief, as if the summit invitation had been written on the back of a lottery ticket. In the hallway outside the secure comms wing, a pair of enlisted airmen in ABUs stepped aside for her to badge through. The smiles they gave were polite but guarded, the kind that left space for judgment. A senior petty officer, leaning against the wall with a coffee in hand, watched her with the neutral expression of someone taking in more than they were saying. Inside the controlled area, the air was cooler, the hum of equipment constant. She scanned her KAC card at the inner door, the green light flashing before the lock released. Beyond the entry, a row of restricted entry signs lined the wall, each with its own clearance code. Emily moved past them without pause, setting her tote on the workbench assigned to the translation team. By mid-morning, the civilian supervisor from her contracted section appeared in the doorway. His tone was clipped, eyes narrowing as he asked where her loyalty sat now that she had been singled out in front of foreign officials. He did not raise his voice, but the implication was there, heavy enough to carry past the words. Emily kept her hands steady on the stack of documents she was logging, neither meeting the hostility nor stepping back from it. She slid the top file into a classified pouch, sealed it, and logged the time on the chain of custody sheet. The only sound was the pen scratching across the paper. Her silence was not retreat, but a choice, the same kind she had made in uniform when talk risked more than it fixed. The supervisor left without pushing further, his footsteps fading into the hallway. By late afternoon, her work had passed through 3 levels of verification without a single correction. One of the enlisted analysts brought over a stack of intercepted transcripts and, without looking up, asked if she could take the high-priority ones first. It was not framed as praise, but the trust was in the handover. When she left at 17:30, the CAC scanner gave its muted beep, releasing her to the main corridor. The same 2 civilians from the morning were still by the vending machine, but this time they didn't look away when she passed. The comments had slowed, replaced by something quieter, harder to define. She walked on without breaking stride, her pace steady against the Pentagon's constant rhythm. The convoy dropped her 2 blocks from the summit venue, the rest of the approach done on foot under the eyes of an armed security detail. K9 units moved along the perimeter, handlers keeping the leashes short as the dogs worked in tight arcs. Every attendee passed through multiple layers badge scan, body wand, and a walk-through sensor sweep. Her contractor ID was checked twice against a printed list, and a plainclothes officer made a note in the margin before waving her through. Inside, The lobby opened into a high-ceilinged hall filled with the low murmur of side conversations. Rows of national flags lined the walls above where senior military officers, defense ministers, and civilian defense contractors gathered in loose clusters. A Marine Guard stood by the main entrance to the summit floor, his uniform pressed, M17 holstered at his side, eyes scanning the room without pause. Emily moved to the interpreter's table positioned along the side wall, close enough to catch tone but outside the main camera angles. She set her tote on the floor, adjusted the headset over her hair, and tested the mic with a brief phrase. Her hand moved to the volume control without looking, the motion fluid from years of habit. She opened her notepad, the first page already split into columns for language notes and military terminology. The Gulf State Air Force general sat across from a U.S. Air Force Major General in service dress blues. Their conversation opened on sortie readiness rates, the Gulf officer noting the need to keep F-16CD aircraft at above 75% mission-capable status. Emily delivered the English version cleanly, carrying the officer's respectful deference in tone. When the Major General responded with details on flight hour budgets and depot maintenance cycles, she rendered it in Arabic with precise technical phrasing, using the exact terms for block upgrades and avionics packages that the Gulf side used in their own manuals. The discussion shifted to scheduled overhauls and the strain on pilot training hours when jets were down for extended maintenance. Emily kept the rhythm steady, adjusting her phrasing when a term in English carried a bureaucratic edge that could sound dismissive in Arabic. She balanced it with language that preserved military courtesy, the kind only someone with uniform time would think to include. Midway through, another interpreter at the far table misrendered a phrase about cost sharing, making it sound like the U.S. side expected immediate payment. The Gulf officer's posture stiffened, his hand pausing over his notes, without breaking cadence. Emily caught the misstep and wove the corrected meaning into her next translation. She did it without drawing attention, shifting the word order so it seemed like a natural clarification rather than an override. The Gulf general's shoulders eased, his tone resuming its earlier cadence. The Major General glanced toward Emily for half a second, then back to his counterpart, continuing without pause. At the interpreter's table, no one spoke about the correction, but 2 seats down, an older translator gave her a subtle nod. For the rest of the session, Emily stayed locked in the exchange, her pen marking the occasional technical note, her delivery unwavering. The summit floor moved through its agenda, but within her arc of hearing, the dialogue between the two generals stayed clear and unbroken. By the time they shook hands, both sides knew they had been understood exactly as intended. And that was the point. She slipped the headset off, set it neatly on the table, and closed her notepad without a sound. The summit's final session had ended, and the main hall was emptying into the muted hum of side conversations. Emily was gathering her notepad when a senior defense attaché from the Gulf State delegation stepped quietly to her table. He spoke her name as if confirming she was the one, then asked her to walk with him. They moved into a side corridor where the carpet absorbed most of the sound, and framed photographs of past joint operations lined the walls. In a voice pitched for her alone, he thanked her for ensuring the talks had stayed on course. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen how easily negotiations could fracture over language, and the look in his eyes said more than protocol ever could. From his pocket, he produced a small challenge coin. The emblem was etched with the crest of his Air Force, polished but worn at the edges from being carried. He placed it in her hand without ceremony, the way one service member might acknowledge another's work across ranks and uniforms. She closed her fingers around it, the cool metal warming against her palm. Back at her hotel, the hallway was quiet, the air faint with the scent of fresh polish on the floor. Inside her room, she hung her jacket over the chair, the interpreter's badge still clipped to the breast pocket. She unzipped her bag just far enough to slip the coin into an inner pouch, resting it on top of a small stack of neatly folded notes. She sat at the desk, opened her notebook, and began updating her language references from the day. Each line captured a phrase, an idiom, a tone shift worth remembering. Outside, the city lights moved against the curtains, but she did not glance up. When she closed the notebook, the coin was already part of her kit, not for display, but for the quiet reminder it carried. For Emily, the value had never been in titles or headlines. It was in the work done right, the message delivered as intended, and the knowledge that the people who needed to understand each other had left the table still talking. Some people move through rooms without anyone noticing until the moment they are needed most. Emily's path was not one of loud arrivals or public applause. It was a series of quiet decisions, made with steady hands and an unshaken voice, even when the air around her turned sharp. For those who have been talked over, doubted, or treated as if their work could not matter, her story holds a familiar rhythm, the kind where skill is built long before it is seen, where the hours no one counts end up deciding the moment that does. There is a discipline in that, the same kind you hear in the low hum of an airfield at night or in the even turn of papers across a desk. She left the summit without cameras, without headlines, and without a single person announcing her name. Yet in her bag, the small weight of a challenge coin carried its own truth, that somewhere, someone understood exactly what she had done and why it mattered. Maybe you have your own version of that coin, a moment no one else will remember but you, where you knew you had done the work right. Hold on to it. There is always another room, another conversation, another door that will open when you least expect it.